Howdy doody everybody, and welcome back to my journey across the United States. Today we're covering Oklahoma's weird folklore, because urban legends aren't always ghosts or ghouls. They might be the local story of buried treasure, a geologic feature with supposed magical powers, or even that guy in the neighborhood who goes for walks in his underpants. And on the topic of Oklahoma, no, I will not be talking about that one with the gerbils today. You know what I'm talking about if you know, and don't look it up if you don't. Now, some quick notes. For Oklahoma, I've already made a cryptids video for the state where I mispronounced Falk, Arkansas, way too much. Sorry about that, folks. I'm also making a Ghosts of Oklahoma video right now that'll be coming out in October, so keep an eye out for that. Beyond this, I just want to say thank you for tuning in, and I want to let you know that if you want to help me out, the best possible thing you can do for me is subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment. It'll never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. With this in mind, come with me today, and let's see what Oklahoma's got in store in the weird department. In 1944, some strange things were going on in Tulsa. One Carolyn Smith, a 51-year-old, had been noticed illegally obtaining food rations for her dog while police officers were investigating World War II ration books for fraud. And in the darkness of night, she was also seen digging out a grave in her backyard. The house she lived in was also heard with screams beaming out of it in the middle of the night. All of this strangeness eventually led neighbors to call the police, who, upon investigation, found an empty casket was buried in the backyard of the home. But also in this home, there were two women, ages 31 and 30, living in just terrible conditions in the basement of the house. The two women were supposedly hypnotized or something, and essentially they were convinced to work all day and give their earnings to Carolyn Smith. Carolyn Smith, on the other hand, was living upstairs like royalty off of 2 paychecks. And as if it couldn't get worse, Carolyn was also somehow convincing one of the women's fathers to give her money for nursing care for the woman that she was essentially just keeping as pets. The two women she kept downstairs were, in exchange, somehow convinced they would have eternal life if they did all of this for Carolyn, and therefore they were sleeping in the cold basement, actually in crates, literally like dogs. Additionally, surrounding this was the fact that matters in the home were already suspicious, with Carolyn's husband passing away about 10 years earlier, and even her maid being hit by a car while fleeing the home 9 years earlier, with the man driving the car actually ending up passing away too. It should be noted that both her husband and the maid had nice insurance policies that somehow Carolyn was able to get her hands on, particularly weird in the case of the maid. Ultimately, this prompted Carolyn to be taken to trial, which sentenced her for some jail time, and after her sentence, she disappeared. Now, the home this took place in is lovingly referred to as the Tulsa Hex House. A lot of people attribute some supernatural stuff to it, but this is really just a tale of fraud and mistreatment of human beings. The home was ultimately torn down in 1975, and today all that remains is the home's stairs and the basement underneath at 10 East 21st Street in Tulsa. Nowadays, although the house itself is gone, there's a haunted attraction that bears its name in the form of a walk-through haunted house attraction to just kind of get young Tulsa natives out of the house, I guess. It's pretty much nothing now, but anyways, this is just a crazy story about a crazy woman who treated people pretty terribly, and maybe offed a couple people beforehand too. Wild stuff. If you're savvy on your history, ancient, underground Chinese cities should be something you've heard mentioned before. From an ancient underground network of tunnels below Beijing to a nearly 5,000-year-old stone city found in Inner Mongolia, the Chinese are no stranger to building underground. But what if I told you in the 1800s and 1900s, rumors were circulating that there was another underground Chinese city, this time buried below Oklahoma City, where there were not only tunnels leading between Chinese businesses, but also an entire underground city full of Chinese migrants with businesses, living quarters, temples, and more. Now, let me be clear, if the following story exudes racism or harmful stereotypes, these are not my views. I'm just sharing history and the opinions of folks from the past as I've uncovered them. The following saga and speculation are regarding underground cities that supposedly dwelled below OKC as reported by the old-time media in Oklahoma City. 19th century China was sort of in chaos. Like many groups of immigrants that came to America, their reason for doing so was because their home country was experiencing extreme economic troubles leading to poverty and famine. Contrast this with the prospect of wealth in America during the timely California gold rush, and things were clearly looking a bit better on this side of the Pacific. But sadly, the grass is not always greener, as when the gold rush ended, suddenly there was a new cheap source of labor in the US, and many of the Chinese were put to work on farms, in laundromats, and of course as railroad workers. Hence why almost any 5th grader can tell you that in the 1900s it was the Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, as they immigrated to the US, some of them actually made their way to Oklahoma City and the rest of the Midwest, and it's estimated that in the year 1900, about 200 Chinese lived in Oklahoma City. Now, in the year 1900, it's worth noting the USA didn't necessarily like the Chinese. Many white individuals felt that their willingness to accept low-paying jobs was pushing the white man to accept worse living conditions and working conditions, and this sentiment had spread throughout the US government and workforce, leading to decisions such as one excluding Chinese from American citizenship, and the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that actually briefly banned Chinese immigration to the USA until they became our ally in World War II, at which point they were admitted to the USA in limited numbers. In the midst of all of this, the Chinese in the USA in 1900, supposedly feeling the pressure, decided it might be better to get away from prying eyes and move slightly underground. This story is perpetuated by publications in the newspaper, The Oklahoman, such as the 1921 article that details health department inspectors and a police officer being led through caverns underneath OKC's Chinatown while inspecting a business. And then, when they went to go see another business that was also Chinese-owned, they were greeted happily, almost as if they'd been expecting the visit. This led the group to suspect that somehow the business they'd just visited had, through a network of tunnels connecting the businesses, managed to warn the second business of a looming inspection. This is all considering the fact that the inspectors did not see telephones in the first business, by the way. Now, tunnels like these were never actually found, nor was the rumor of an underground cemetery or temple ever confirmed, but there were some findings in the basements below restaurants at least. For instance, in August of 1922, below a Chinese restaurant, an opium den was discovered. Apparently, it wasn't all too uncommon for legal Chinese Americans to allow smuggling operations, drug trafficking, and even illegal Chinese immigrants to dwell on their premises, or to even rent out parts of their facilities to these individuals and to turn a blind eye to whatever they were doing down there. They were also more than happy to accept the cheap illegal Chinese labor, according to the accounts I'm reading. Now, it's worth noting that accounts like these were essentially real and slightly suspicious findings that were probably mixed with the accounts of illicit activity in the basements of Chinese-owned establishments, and I suspect this is what led to the sentiment told among white communities at the time that the Chinese citizens of Oklahoma had subterranean lairs where they operated illegal businesses far and wide, and perhaps even lived. At this point, you'd probably think this was mostly nonsense. Except in April of 1969, something curious was found. Some construction crews in the city were demolishing some unused buildings when suddenly they discovered, I quote, a set of expertly crafted stone stairs. These stairs ended facing a wooden door with a Chinese padlock on it, leading to what were essentially ruins of an old Chinese laundry and opium den, with a basement that had little bitty rooms from which no outside light could have gotten to. On the walls there were old Chinese cartoons and newspapers. It's hard to imagine that as you walk through Oklahoma City these days, similar dens don't exist, hidden but waiting to be found, under your feet. Perhaps there was some truth in the idea that the Chinese were living underground after all. It may not have been the intricate tunnels that the white neighborhoods of Oklahoma City imagined, and they certainly weren't in the form of an underground city, but it does appear there's some physical evidence, in addition to the oral history that's there, pointing towards underground Chinese settlements in Oklahoma City. hidden deep within the Wichita Mountains, there's a legend that can go toe-to-toe with that of the lost Adams Diggins about a metal door behind which gold is tightly sealed and stashed, possibly among the bodies of those that dug it up in the first place. This is the story of the legendary iron door in the Wichita Mountains. Now, the legend I stated is pretty much the gist of it. A fabled treasure lies behind an iron door. Some say mined gold was stashed there, and other stories say that the door conceals the mine shaft itself. No single story seems to entirely agree on this, nor do these stories agree regarding who put the gold there in the first place. A common contender for the gold's original owner are, of course, the Spanish, who supposedly did what they did and enslaved natives and forced them to mine golds, when they identified a suitable mine in the Wichita Mountains. If you believe this legend, the Spanish, mid-mining, decided they urgently needed to leave, and rather than let the natives go and spread the word of their gold, they actually decided to seal the native slaves inside of the mine, alongside their treasure, leaving what would today be skeletons of natives alongside piles of gold, in a scene that would look all too familiar in any Indiana Jones movie. In this version of the story, there's also a haunted element, with the native ghosts generally guarding the cave. Suspect number 2 was named Belle Starr in life. She was a female outlaw with a knack for helping criminals turn their stolen goods into cold hard cash. She was basically an OG money launderer. As her version of the tale goes, in the 1880s, she helped a gang get a hold of about $500,000 in today's money, and rather than let them spend it willy-nilly, she offered them the hot tip to take the cash and stow it away in the mountains behind a door, covering it with rocks and dirt. Now, of course, in this version of the tale, the outlaws she helped got thrown in the slammer for good after their next heist, and she actually got blasted with 2 shotgun shells shortly after, leaving the whereabouts of the door, in this case, a mystery as well. Next up, there's Jesse James, who ran the appropriately named James Gang, and apparently they stole about $1 million modern dollars from a Mexican caravan in the area, deciding to hide it away in the Wichita Mountains. James is also connected to Belle Starr, so some decide that this and the prior legend are somehow conflated, with Belle Starr essentially consulting for the James Gang to help them pull off a heist. Now, this story isn't totally bogus. Some stolen goods from the James Gang have actually been found in the Wichita Mountains, but certainly not $1 million in gold. Rather, the James Gang treasure that was found was actually just a kettle, with the name of the James Gang adhered upon it, as you can see in this photograph of an old news clipping. But at least this treasure was found using one of Jesse James' treasure maps, so maybe there is some credence here. So, while it's not entirely conclusive who buried the gold, if the gold even ever existed in the first place, these suspects generally point to the gold having been buried in the 1880s at the latest, given that's when Jesse and Belle passed away. Of course, we wouldn't know for sure who it was unless the treasure was found, given this whole saga is sort of based on hearsay. But hey, that's what a proper treasure hunt should be, right? And while this treasure hasn't been found, or at least brought forward, I should note there are quite a few stories of folks who claim to have found the treasure. Now, of these stories, the most likely to be embellished was a story of a guy who apparently found the treasure map that led him to the door in the late 1800s, and he actually broke it open, finding gold and skeletons. But of course, those dastardly Native Americans showed up and chased him off. In my personal opinion, I couldn't find a consistent name attached to this story, or to the person that told it, and given somehow natives were apparently guarding the treasure like this one smells like BS. There's also a story from the early 1900s that's far more credible in my eyes, where a father and son duo that were ranchers were riding their horses near Elk Mountain in a canyon when they suddenly spotted some glare coming off of the eastern side of the canyon. Rather than explore, they decided to go home, only to, a few years later, actually hear the story I'm telling right now and go back to investigate. They obviously could not find the door upon their second inspection. Next, there was a man named Silas Lee Isom, who was a gold prospector, who apparently had a tale of a woman named Holt from Missouri. This woman in 1908 apparently had a map and key that were given to her by a nameless outlaw at his deathbed, and this outlaw told her, on his deathbed I should say, of an iron door in the mountains. Now, she followed this map and tried to find the treasure and open the door with the key, but obviously she didn't find it. And this is the general gist of all of the people who claim they found the treasure. I won't bore you farther. Beyond these stories, there are also a few short and sweet tales of young boys finding doors in the woods, and there was also a middle-aged man in his 60s who was apparently wandering the woods lost and found the door and didn't think much of it, and then heard about the door and decided he was going to go back for the door and had a heart attack on his way back. And there's also a handful of hunters that have claimed to see weird doors in the mountains. But none of these folks have come forward with any definitive proof on the matter, so for now, this is all staying unsolved. But what do you think? I mean, clearly outlaws were stashing their treasure in the Wichita Mountains. There's proof of it with Jesse James. But do you actually believe that millions of dollars of gold are stashed away? Clearly, I'm no definitive source on this matter, but I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. The Karen Silkwood story is the sort of tale that stirs a deep sense of outrage and possibly highlights the extent to which powerful companies and possibly the government can evade accountability. It's a story about an individual with a good heart who put herself in the line of fire with the hope of protecting her fellow employees, only to find herself far out of her depth. Then at the end, you sort of think it might even have a happy ending, and when you least expect it, you watch the bad guy get away with the crime and ride off into the sunset with his big wad of cash and possibly a nuclear warhead. Karen Silkwood was born in Texas, and as a high school student, she developed a fascination with chemistry, a passion that apparently guided her future as she enrolled at Lamar College in Beaumont, Texas to become a medical technician. Her academic journey was cut short though, because just after 1 year in college, she got pregnant and decided to become a mother rather than follow the academic pathway she was on. This too deteriorated, as her marriage was strained by financial mismanagement and her husband's infidelity, leading to the couple declaring bankruptcy and ultimately getting a divorce. These are the circumstances that led Karen to get a job at Karen McGee, a company that produced plutonium fuel rods in Crescent, Oklahoma. Her role here involved polishing fuel rods filled with radioactive plutonium pellets, a task that exposed her to hazardous conditions. Soon after she began work there, an unsuccessful strike was held, which dissuaded many of the union members on site, causing lots of folks to quit. But not Karen. Karen ended up joining the union's bargaining committee, dedicating herself to improving the health and safety conditions for workers at the plant. This led her to uncover alarming violations. She found that workers were exposed to unsafe levels of radiation due to faulty respiratory equipment and improper handling of radioactive samples, and she actually took her findings to the Atomic Energy Commission in 1974. Among the allegations was the disturbing claim that enough plutonium was missing from the plant to build multiple nuclear warheads. The situation took a sinister turn when Karen, after a routine self-check, found herself contaminated with plutonium, seemingly by accident. During this self-check, she discovered her body had levels of plutonium contamination that were about 400 times the acceptable limit. Further analysis revealed that plutonium had been deliberately placed inside of her gloves, suggesting maybe an attempt to poison her. The following day, despite having only done paperwork, she was again found to have been exposed. She was once again decontaminated, but later her home was investigated and also found to be radioactive, leading to an investigation by the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Now, it was presumed by Karen and her family at this point that the company, in an attempt to shut Karen up, was exposing her purposefully to radioactive materials. But somehow this didn't dissuade Karen, and she continued to prepare to expose the company's wrongdoing to the media, and now on her laundry list of things to expose was her own contamination. On November 13, 1974, this led her to leave a union meeting at her workplace with a binder full of evidence against Karen McGee and drive to meet a New York Times journalist in Oklahoma City. Tragically, that was the last time she was ever seen alive. Her car was discovered crashed in a culvert on Highway 74 with no sign of the documentation she had been carrying. That evidence was gone and was never to be seen again. Karen was pronounced dead at the scene. Inside of her car, there were a ton of illicit substances, none of which she had previously been known to use, and those were blamed for her accident, ruling it a simple case of a traffic accident induced by substance abuse. assuming she'd just become drowsy and drifted off the road. This, of course, wouldn't explain the skid marks and the dents on her car that indicated she could have been forced off of the road or tried to avoid whatever fate had befallen her regardless. Karen's family indeed suspected her passing was due to foul play, especially since she had reported receiving threatening phone calls prior to her death. An examination of her remains revealed plutonium contamination consistent with inhalation and ingestion. Further investigations uncovered that 44 to 66 pounds of plutonium had even gone missing from the plant, prompting a federal investigation. The plant was eventually shut down in 1975, and Karen's family pursued legal action against Karen McGee for negligence, during which time they and their legal representation were continuously harassed, and an investigator even went quote-unquote missing during the whole ordeal. Despite the intimidation and mysterious threats that plagued their legal efforts, Karen McGee eventually settled out of court, paying them $1.38 million. Through this, the company admitted no wrongdoing. Perhaps the most damning detail of this whole case is that through the research done by the family's lawyers, there was speculation that she had unwittingly uncovered a larger plot to smuggle plutonium abroad, potentially involving the US government and Israel. To this day, these theories remain speculation, as the out-of-court settlement apparently ended the matter. Whatever the truth is, it seems those behind it, if there truly was a conspiracy, got away with it. In 1907, Pauls Valley State Training School for White Boys was established, and soon there was a thriving campus with a farm, classrooms, dormitories, and more. This wasn't any normal school, though. Rather, young men who had committed crimes ranging from petty theft to flat-out assault, battery, and murder were sent to the school to have their behavior refined and corrected. Perhaps it's because of some of the heinous crimes that the boys had committed that the facility took an approach with a focus on military-style discipline. By the way, I kid you not, there are literal accounts of boys in this school that were sent there for theft of food who were placed in the same classroom as kids that slaughtered their families. That's quite an amount of contrast, even for a legitimate prison, let alone, a school for kids. The way the school operated was by basically having the boys not only get a decent education, but a strong work ethic, and by making them perform manual labor, I suppose, as punishment. Here in the mornings, the boys would work in the fields, and by afternoon, they would attend the school. And then later in the day, they'd usually practice trades ranging from cooking and pressing to farming and engineering. Generally speaking, this was a school that hoped to prepare young men for what was then the real world. From what I can tell, boys weren't generally permanently posted here after their sentencing. Rather, they were, on average, placed in this facility for just about a year and a half, or shorter if they took to their new, more disciplined lives quickly. If you can't tell, the place was essentially a prison for children, although at least a relatively nice one. Around 1945, the purpose for this building shifted, though, and it became a hospital for epileptics. Today, the Department of Corrections has taken over portions of the facility, and they're transforming it into a law enforcement training site, with the new facility set to be named the Wichita Valley Complex. Alright, so compared to the last story, this one is the definition of chill. Here we have a special road near Springer, Oklahoma, where it appears that gravity has decided to look the other way. If you're driving down the road, to the eye it pretty much looks like you're going uphill, but if you're bold enough to stop your car on the road and throw it in neutral, you'll find that your car actually rolls what appears to be up the hill. Now, of course, plenty of folks say, "It's a ghost," or "This here be aliens," or even, "There's a strong magnetic field right below this road," with some even claiming there must be a giant magnet buried under the ground at the top of the hill, or that even this is caused by a gravitational anomaly. But these stories fall on their heads when you realize that, if you pour water on the ground, it'll flow uphill too, and, well, water isn't magnetic, right? Same thing with a soccer ball. And if this were just actually some weird gravitational phenomenon, well, let's just say you wouldn't only notice it on the hill. Everything in the area would be being pulled in the direction of the top of the hill. Now I know this is a boring story, and most of y'all probably know how it ends. In short, this is just an optical illusion. Basically, the real deal here is that the Gravity Hills slope is really slight, and the trees and foliage are ever so slightly leaning in a direction that would suggest a slight hill. And thus, while you're on a hill, and uphill appears to be in one direction, and reality uphill is in the opposite direction. I'd sort of laugh at this, but apparently enough people experience this optical illusion that it was reported all over the place when I was researching weird stuff in Oklahoma. So hey, maybe it's worth checking out. In Ohio, we saw the center of the world, a town that was founded on high hopes, but remains as more of a memory or maybe even just as a novelty. Here in Oklahoma, there's a place with an even more ambitious name though, the center of the universe. So once again, I reiterate, is this the terrible place where the world elite conspire to convince us that butter is bad for you, that D&D doesn't lead our youth to adopt Satanism, and that birds are real? Well, once again, not quite. Rather, the center of the universe is actually a small 8-foot diameter concrete circle, which in the center houses an acoustic phenomenon where, essentially, if you're in the center, any noise you make is loudly echoed off of the nearby concrete benches. But outside of the circle, you can barely hear a single thing. The structure was originally actually on the Boston Avenue Bridge. Back then, it was a bridge for vehicles and there was no echo. But a fire damaged the bridge, and they ended up making the area into a pedestrian walkway in the 1980s. During which time they designed the concrete benches, and as the story goes, they accidentally created this acoustic phenomenon. It's also not even clear who started calling it the center of the universe, and given it was constructed and this name started pre-internet, the origin of the name might be lost to time, or more likely is confined to the archives of a local library that I'd have to drive 1,000 miles to get my hands on. Regardless, this obscure attraction is visited by 10,000 folks per year, and it's frankly the sort of odd experience that I would personally love to stop by. Near Edmond, Oklahoma, a city with nearly 100,000 people in central Oklahoma, there sits a creepy abandoned circus that as of recent is said to have been completely overgrown with vegetation. There's a lot of urban legends that this spot is haunted, either by the old animals held at this location, or hilariously by the ghosts of old circus clowns. But in reality, the only thing haunting this place for the past few decades are the clout chasers and mischievous kids that probably frequent the closest businesses just down the road from the property, a vape shop and a Sonic drive-in. Maybe this is some kind of vape, snacks, abandoned places holy trifecta, but I digress. This abandoned circus is known locally as Gandini's Circus, and right off the bat, I should say that who Gandini was and whether he was even real is dubious at best, probably an urban legend in its own right. In reality, the abandoned circus equipment dates back to a circus that was started in the early 1900s that fell apart due to the Great Depression, leading to it being bought in 1943 by one Howard Suez, who used the assets of the circus to start the Clyde Brothers Circus, an indoor circus that performed in stadiums and arenas. In 1949, he also opened the Hagen Brothers Circus, an outdoor version of the Clyde Brothers Circus that was a tent show. This property's role in the whole saga is that it was used as a winter camp for the animals and animal tamers because of Edmond's mild climate, and because of its access to rail lines passing through the area. Now, I should note that the next phase in life for the circus is a bit confusing. One source I read stated that in 1976, the circus was sold to Carden and Johnson International Circus, and the winter camp was moved, leaving much of the old equipment that housed and trained animals to just deteriorate for decades. Another source that is perhaps more reputable states that the property now belongs to one Jose Bereda, a relative of the circus's late lion tamer who had the circus camp property deeded to him when the old owner passed away. Now, where the camp used to operate, there are 4 or 5 trailers where the clowns, acrobats, and animals used to be housed. These days, much of the remaining circus equipment is vandalized, but perhaps for the better, it's on the way out too. The last news reports of the place's condition I read, and all of the YouTube videos I watched, suggest the place is in pretty poor condition, and it's been overtaken by vegetation and probably is in an unsafe state, given folks know its location and regularly trespass there. As of 7 months ago, a local news station also seemed to report that the abandoned equipment was still in the area, though I'm not entirely sure because as of June 2023, plans were announced to remove the circus equipment and make it a multi-use development. But at least the developers plan to give the new development a circus-themed flair. I don't entirely mind this. Sure, we're losing a creepy abandoned place, but with time a new one will pop up, and at least the history of this plot of land is going to be remembered in its design. According to the developer, he's going to try to incorporate parts of the abandoned circus equipment in the new establishment. So at least this cool, creepy, and kind of iconic haunt for the locals will be remembered. In Oklahoma, there's a simple myth that although Oklahoma is certainly landlocked from an oceanic or Great Lakes perspective, the state of Oklahoma has more shoreline than any other state. The legend claims that somehow its lake shores total to giving the state the most shoreline of all. I mean, let's think about it. The state does have 3,000 lakes and ponds totaling more than 10 acres, and 200 of them are man-made lakes, so maybe it's possible. That is, until you consider the fact that pretty much every state, even landlocked ones, have a ton of interior lakes. Sorry to burst the bubble of folks that might believe this, but Minnesota, for instance, has almost 12,000 lakes that are 10 acres or larger. And don't even get me started on Alaska. They have literally 3 million lakes that are 5 acres or more in size. Sadly, Oklahoma just doesn't stack up in this regard, and this is most certainly an urban legend, as Oklahoma, in actuality, is 35th among all states for the percentage of water surface versus land area, and it doesn't even crack the top 30 in terms of shoreline. In the Wichita Mountains near Lawton, Oklahoma, there's a spot called the Parallel Forest. In this forest you can find 20,000 red cedars, and these trees, planted across a 16-acre area, are exactly 6 feet apart across the entire forest. In this forest, there are various legends of everything from buried bodies to the Gandini, or basically an owl-like variant of the skinwalker, to forces that will drive folks to go insane and become disoriented. Some even say that witches roam this forest, and because of its relative similarity throughout, the center is hard to find, so the witchers have established an altar where they hold their dastardly ceremonies in the center. So is it true, though? Are monsters roaming this forest, and are they the reason that this forest has grown in such an odd fashion? Well, gosh darn it, no! Get your head on straight. This wasn't done by the forces of evil. This was done by the US government, which I guess occasionally can be considered a force of evil. But at least they don't use black magic, right? In reality, the forest is indeed a bit weird, and the pictures definitely make it feel a bit eerie, given no forest I've ever been in is so symmetrical, but it's not flippin' haunted, or at least it's not paranormal forces to blame for making it look this way. In reality, the forest was planted in 1912 to fight back against the Dust Bowl, a time in American history when dust storms were essentially sweeping across the plains region because of the combination of an ongoing drought, strong winds, and farmers plowing up large swaths of land that had previously been grassed, or grassy, I guess I should say, holding the soils in place. Now sure, in this forest there are weird noises, but goodness gracious, haven't you heard there are animals that live in forests, and they are well known to make noises. There's also a really weird circle near the edge of the forest that helps push the whole witch legend, but in reality it's just a relic from the Wichita Mountain Gold Rush in the early 1900s. Basically, rocks would be brought back to this spot that kind of looks like an altar, and they would be crushed to see if gold were inside. The icing on the cake is that the Parallel Forest isn't actually even named the Parallel Forest, its real name is simply just the Cedar Planting. So in short, no, the Parallel Forest isn't some dreadful place like a lot of websites say, it's just a forest that was kind of planted by people, so it's symmetrical. Still weird though. So, controversial topic here. Remember that runestone in Minnesota that, if real, would have suggested the Vikings went inland from Newfoundland and actually explored inland North America? Yeah. Well, that one was clearly a fake. But as it turns out, a similar runestone exists in Oklahoma in Heavener Runestone Park. Now, the story of these Swedish inscriptions begins for our modern audience in the 1920s, when in an area that is now the park, the stone bearing the writings was found by a Western audience. and later it was realized through Choctaw oral history that at some time in the 1800s, probably the 1830s, a hunting party of natives actually supposedly discovered the stone. Now, of course, it's pretty fishy to find old Swedish runes in the middle of the modern-day USA, and some take this whole episode to suggest that this would have put Vikings in Oklahoma in 1000 AD, roughly around the time it's speculated that Vikings were in Minnesota, if that stone were true. And it's worth keeping in mind that stone probably isn't real. Others think it's more likely that the rune was carved into the stone in the 1700s when, during La Salle's expedition to claim a strategic French settlement near the Gulf of Mexico, someone on his crew may have gotten down to carving. There's also some speculation that the stone may generally just be a hoax, which is more modern than either of the previous episodes I discussed. This wouldn't really be a surprise given that there are no other artifacts in the region, even suggesting that Vikings found their way to modern-day Oklahoma. It's worth noting that this lack of evidence would be weird because they left plenty of evidence behind in modern-day Canada when they settled there for a while. Now, the reason this park centered around the runestone exists in the first place can be attributed to one Gloria Farley, who developed a passion for the runestone in the 1920s when she was young, and when she was older she became obsessed with solving the mystery. Through her, the runestone gained international attention and was even translated to Nome Valley, although some of these stories about professors conducting these translations appear to have been fabricated because you'll often find that the individuals mentioned in the stories or the universities they were supposedly affiliated with don't actually exist. So as you can probably tell, the prevailing opinion is that the runestone is a hoax that was likely inscribed after Westerners had fully established themselves in North America. Just who created this inscription, though, will likely remain a mystery. Who knows? Given the inscription says Nome Valley, though, maybe it was some mischievous gnome that decided to make his mark on history. If you haven't seen Mr. Ed, by golly, I'm not sure we can be friends. Look him up right now. Type in Mr. Ed Talking Horse. Do it. Google it. Particularly, look up the episode where he plays for the Dodgers and hits a home run. Made my day when I was 9 years old. Anyways, Mr. Ed wasn't just a crazy character in a TV show and a beloved part of my childhood. He was a real horse, or really multiple horses if you count the first pilot, which were a chestnut gelding in the first pilot that I can't really seem to find the name of, but he did play Mr. Ed once, but not for long because he had a bad disposition. And then there was a second Mr. Ed that was a horse named Bamboo Harvester, a mixed breed of horse who was in the show's second pilot episode and the duration of the series. Now, the reason that I'm talking about this amazing horse is that on Highway 82 in Oklahoma, you can find a large gravestone, and below it lies the horse that played Mr. Ed. On it reads, "This monument was dedicated to the loving memory of Mr. Ed on Sunday, August 26, 1990. It is the result of a heartfelt fundraising effort by the people of northeastern Oklahoma and Tulsa radio station Z104.5 FM. According to national media reports, Mr. Ed moved to Oklahoma in the late 1960s after a successful Hollywood career, and he continued to entertain and bring joy to many Oklahomans. Finally retiring in this very field, Mr. Ed passed away February 22, 1970. Sadly, the horse that was Mr. Ed passed away due to age-related issues, kidney issues, and arthritis mostly. On the gravestone is the inscription of Mr. Ed, the horse, looking out of his barn window. Hot diggity dog, who's cutting onions up in here? Anyways, I just thought I should spread the gospel of Ed and let you know that in this field, Ed seemed to happily spend his final days, and if you want to pay this icon that made you laugh as a kid or maybe an adult a visit, you can do so. May you keep hitting home runs in the afterlife. Good horsey. Now, in my video on Georgia, we saw a healing springs, and I thought the concept of collecting healing water in your camelback and bringing it home was pretty neat. But in Skiatook, Oklahoma, a bit north of Tulsa, they have a healing rock. Sadly, from what I'm able to tell, you're not able to take this baby home. The origin of this rock has been told to us through the Osage and Quapaw oral history, and it's said that in the 19th century, these cultures told the tale of this rock having mystical powers to heal the ailments of afflicted individuals. Now, the rock itself is 12 feet high and 17 feet wide, and almost looks kind of man-made because it's nearly a perfect triangle with one of its points angled into the air, but according to archaeologists who have examined the rock, it's actually a natural formation formed by erosion, giving it this odd pointed shape. The rock actually used to be located in what's now Skiatook Lake, and during the creation of the lake, it would have been submerged, but lucky for the rock and the nearby communities in 1985, locals campaigned to have it moved, leading to its relocation to its modern location. Not much else to say here, though. If you buy the stories, you can go visit this rock yourself. You can touch it, you can hug it, you can lick it if you dare, but I warn against this approach because you probably wouldn't be the first to do so. Winganon is awesome. I drove through it once and I'm pretty sure I could have taken my hands off the steering wheel for at least 45 minutes and been alright. Not that I recommend doing this. Sadly though, when I passed through, apparently I missed its best known feature, a space capsule. Apparently, alongside Winganon Road between Highway 169 and Oologah Lake, there's what looks to be a Cold War era space capsule just lying on the side of the road. But I promise you, NASA didn't forget to pick up its astronauts back in the day. Rather, the space capsule lookalike is actually just the main vessel of a concrete mixing truck that was left behind after an accident a long time ago. Now, I can't necessarily tell you what a long time ago means. Some say this accident happened in the 1950s and others the 1970s. But regardless, a cement truck had a rollover at some point and it got towed away, but in classic towing company fashion, the job was only done halfway. And they left the cement container behind. Maybe it was because it weighed too much, who knows. Eventually, after it seemed like nobody was coming back for the container after decades, a local couple, Heather Thomas and her husband Barry, decided that nobody would care if it got a makeover, and they decided to give it a space capsule-like look with rocket motors, an American flag, little buttons on the side, a window and all. Funny enough, though coincidental, an uncontrolled re-entry of a NASA rocket occurred just days before this makeover was actually performed, and I can't help but wonder if a few people freaked out on their commute to work because of this. Anyways, it looks like this space capsule may be in danger of being moved. Apparently there's past due road construction being performed on Winganon Road, and as of January 2023, it sounds like the plan was to remove the beloved artifact, or at least to relocate it. Personally, I think we should keep the world as weird as possible, so my vote is that it stays, if it hasn't been moved as of this time at least. Now, if I'm ever able to get to this capsule, I'd love to prop up a little alien mannequin next to it for a while. It'll probably get moved, but looking at the photos, I think it would be a nice touch. What do you think? Okay, Oklahoma may not have the most shoreline in the USA, but do you know what it does have? Among the longest, straightest roads in the United States. US 412, running through Oklahoma, has a butt-ton of straight roadway in particular. I'm not even kidding. You can literally use Google Maps measure feature, and there are a few stretches of 412 where you can drop 30-mile-long lines with only 2 points, and those lines will never come off the road at a single point. It's crazy. There's apparently also a stretch of US 54 between Dalhart, Texas and Liberal, Kansas that passes through Oklahoma for much of it. That's 108 miles of just straight boring nothingness. Now, as someone who just moved to the Midwest from New England a while back, I'm still getting used to the concept of open space and straight roads, but I thought this was certainly something weird about Oklahoma that you're not going to find in most states. Normally, when you hear a name like Dead Woman's Crossing, you'd think it was the name of a story, not the name of a place, but believe me when I tell you I was surprised to read that it's actually pretty much both, and the place bearing the name is northeast of a slightly larger city named Weatherford, Oklahoma. Depending on your source, either on July 6th or 7th, in 1905, a woman named Katie DeWitt James, a 29-year-old, brought her 14-month-old baby, Lulu Bell, with her onto a train to visit her cousin in Ripley, Oklahoma. Now, she was alone with her child for a reason. She'd just recently filed for divorce, about a day earlier, to the chagrin of her apparently abusive husband. At the train station, her dad had been there to see her off, and he thought when she reached her cousin, she'd probably send him a letter. But after weeks went by, her father found a detective named Sam Bartell to figure out where his daughter had gone. The detective found that while Katie was supposed to hop off the train further down the line and meet her cousin in Ripley, instead she, for whatever reason, decided to hop off in Weatherford, and she ended up spending the night with her baby with one William Moore, who she was introduced to by a local working woman named Fanny Norton. After this night's stay, it's said that Katie, her baby, and Fanny at some point hopped into a buggy to go to Hydro, and according to witnesses, the buggy returned shortly after, and again it parked at William Moore's house, but this time Katie was missing. After this story was uncovered, apparently the police were able to find the child, at least, Lulu Bell, who I should mention was unharmed, and they were also able to find Fanny Norton and take her into custody. And some sources say that upon this arrest, she actually ended up poisoning herself and passing away before she could stand trial. The next month, supposedly on August 31st, Katie was found by a fisherman near a concrete bridge in an area near Deer Creek, where the police had apparently previously heard that 2 women and a baby that appeared out of place were recently sighted. As you might expect, Katie was no longer alive, and she was also found without a head. Now, I should note that although this feels like it has a pretty clear resolution, the case is labeled as unsolved. I suppose this is because Fanny Norton took her own life before she could stand trial. Anyways, this saga is what established the name of the community, Dead Woman's Crossing. Oklahoma, it's been a real treat learning more about you, and I appreciate your support on my Cryptids of Oklahoma video so far. Hopefully you're a fan of this one too. Remember, in the next few weeks I'll be putting out videos comprehensively covering the haunted places of Oklahoma, Michigan, and New Hampshire in October to celebrate spooky season. With this in mind, I just wanted to say thank you for watching and remind you that whether you woke up to some loud noises only to find a space capsule crashed in your front yard, or if you were walking through a graveyard and you heard a ghostly voice utter, "I am Mr. Red," don't you ever forget, it's always story time.